Melmodoc the Wizard, Siegmeyer the Rogue, and Gulak the Rogue together form some of the worst team compilations you've ever seen. But what is the history of the country that their adventure takes place in? Fret not, as this question will be answered in today's different episode of Dungeon Delvers. Next episode will resume where the group left off, but today, I, Matt, your guide through this wacky history, am here to give you some exposition. In 1162, a long-lived country named Alexandria decided to claim and explore the new lands that had been recently discovered. After an 8-month-long voyage, one large galleon, a crew of 186 people landed on what would become the country of Tymora. They arrived right at the beginning of the summer season with little food left in their ship's storage. But thanks to the land's bountiful collection of flora and fauna, the settlers were able to survive and create a small town on the coast of what would become the barony of fair and the barony of entertainment and trade. Because of the bountiful food on the new land and the sailing adventure that had led them all there, the settlers decided to name the new land Tymora, the goddess of bounty and adventure. In 1170, over the passage of 8 years, the land of Tymora became more and more lived in. The towns grew larger, more land was turned into homes, and more people inhabited the land. With the population growth, it became quickly made known that a government was needed. Edward Grant was a man who was one of the original 186 settlers who very early on had taken up a leadership role to get things in order in Tymora. After a large meeting of most of the people of Tymora, he was chosen to be the country's new king, and the seeds of revolution were planted, with people of Tymora wanting to split away from Alexandria. In 1178, the settlers, now known as Tymorians, knew that when they elected their own king, that it would greatly upset the king of Alexandria. That is why King Edward's first decree was to begin bolstering the country's defenses and to prepare themselves for the war that would surely come. When the king learned of the Tymorian king, he was indeed outraged. By 1172, all of Tymora, as it is in its current day, was discovered. Edward's reign went from the cold peaks of the mountains in the province of education to the sunlight shores of the province of entertainment and trade. All of the time before the arrival of the Alexandrian king's army was spent training soldiers in the province of military, producing as much food as possible in the province of fair, teaching scholars and magicians in the province of education, and making money for the kingdom through trade and with its southern isles. A collection of cities stationed south of Tymora that were all united under one alliance. The northern province helped the cause as well, but its position in the war was lost to time. This fast production of a multitude of things was possible thanks to King Edward's style of government that had the country split up into specialized baronies, so that each baron had only one main production to worry about. In 1188, with the barony system producing resources so efficiently, and the preparations for war years in advance, Tymora successfully defended their country from Alexandria and became an independent country led by King Edward Grant. Though the war was won, the country wouldn't have tranquility for long. 1199. Invaders from the north came down onto the country of Tymora, laying siege onto the shores of the province of trade and entertainment. Though most invaders came on boat onto the shores, some traveled through the northern province, laying waste to the homes and people there, and destroying the means for the production to fulfill their assigned purpose. It wasn't until the invaders had reached the province of Fair that the Baron of the military province sent their troops, vanquishing the invaders. No matter what the military baron said in their defense, the northern province saw this as a high offense. 1201. The military baron's choice to not defend the northern province proved to be quite the terrible one, when in the dark of night, 2 years after the beginning of the invasion, King Edward Grant was killed in his sleep by invaders that had managed to get inside the castle. In the ruckus that ensued after the king's death, the queen was forced to flee the castle in the night. She was never found by the guards after the invaders were killed, and there were no reported sightings of her during the 9-month-long search. 1201. During the search for the queen, the barons came together to decide who should be the next king in case that the queen was not recovered. These were dark times for Tymora. The country was leaderless, the people were distraught over a lost queen, and the tensions between the northern baron and the military baron were still high. 1202. A year had passed without a king. While the barons were able to keep their provinces in order, very little else was happening. The province of Fair was producing food, while the province of Education was teaching students in their colleges. But very little was happening. No new relations with other countries, and no retaliation against the homeland of the invaders for killing King Edward. These were dark times. This is when the Baron of the Northern Province, Baron Barth, nominated himself to take the throne. This was instantly shot down by the Baron of the Military Province. And because there had to be a unanimous agreement between all of the barons, Barth was not made king, and he became even madder at the military barony. 1202. Many times after Barth's nomination of himself, whenever the barons voted on who should become king, Barth voted no. He was abusing the rule of unanimous decision in spite. This is when the other barons came together and decided on the next king without Barth knowing. The barons chose a strong leader in defense against invaders, a man named Arthur Vendrick. When Barth was made aware of the decision, he was all but pleased. 1203. After all was said and done, and Barth's retaliation to the agreement was ignored, Arthur Vendrick was taken to the castle after being informed of the decision and crowned as king. The salt in the wound for the northern barony was that before being crowned king, Arthur was spending his time helping rebuild the northern province after the invasion. All of these things added up to Baron Barth being very upset and willing to do quite radical things. (1205). 2 years had passed, and the reconstruction of the northern province was coming closer and closer to a halt. More and more workers left, and less construction was being funded by the crown, though this was partly due to the crown's treasury making reinforced oceanfront defenses top priority. The king's drink at the next Independence Day celebration, where all the barons feast with the king in the king's ordinary dining room. Barth made one detrimental mistake in his plan, though. He discussed the plan with the poison supplier through the mail instead of meeting him in person. The mail had been intercepted and checked because a letter with a baron's stamp, directed to an ordinary civilian, was quite strange. Come the day of the Independence Feast, King Arthur turned down his drink when it was offered to him. But Barth off guard. Barth turned down the drink in a quite noticeable manner and quickly excused himself from the room, only to be stopped by the castle guards in the doorway. The guards held Barth's letter, which was read out aloud to those who were in the dining room. Barth was taken away by the guards to the dungeon, where he resides for his last days. (1206). A year passed that Barth spent down underground in the castle dungeon, with the king's men trying to extract information from him through questionable methods. It finally came to a point where they felt that he had no longer held any useful information, and Barth was executed publicly in the main street of the castle town. The people of the northern province did not take the leader's public assassination well, and the seeds of rebellion were once again planted in Tymora. (1208). After the North elected a new baron, the province came together and signed a decree that demanded that they become a new independent country. The decree also demanded land from the barony of Fair and the barony of Trade and Entertainment. These two baronies, not willing to lose land, advocated for the king to fight it, and thus started many years of negotiation. (1221). King Arthur Frederick passed away from natural causes in the year 1218. His son, King Arthur Frederick II, ascended to the throne and resumed where his father had left off, trying to negotiate with the northern province. It seemed as though the North was hell-bent on having a war, and wouldn't comply with anything the king said. The North was training more and more men for war, and constructed war machines such as catapults. War was inevitable. (1242). Years of battling pass, much more time than the king and the barons thought would have been needed. Their passive winning wars quickly did not match up with the long, grueling war that seemed never-ending. The North's defensive capabilities were greater than the crown could have expected, but they still managed to break through the North's defenses. The western end of the province was taken over by the military barony, where a second military barony was established, led by Baron Robert Erskine. (1253). Over the years, King Arthur II grew old and passed on the moniker of king to his son, Arthur Vendrick III. Arthur III was crowned at a young age in the year 1238, 3 years before King Arthur II had passed. In the year 1244, King Arthur III had a son who would become the heir to the throne. One night, as the king and his family were eating dinner, northern soldiers crashed through the windows. How they got past the security was unknown. A bowman had shot an arrow and killed the king. The scuffle was quickly dealt with by the king's guard, but the king had still been killed, and Arthur IV was only 9 years old at the time, too young to become king. (1261). 8 years after King Arthur III's death, his son ascends to the throne as king. His will to fight and protect his people was just as strong as his forefathers. The war was coming to a standstill, with the northern province surrounded, but their defenses strong. they weren't faltering to the military's attack. The history of Tymora, while short, is quite eventful and ongoing. See what's next for the country when Dungeon Delver Season 1 comes to an end. But until then, the adventure continues for our titular party, who you'll see again in the next episode.